Hi, I'm Austin Wintory, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about the interactive music system in Stoic's latest game, Towerborne. From the earliest conversations with Arne Jorgensen, our creative director, it became clear that a kind of youthful optimism was at the core of everything Towerborne is supposed to be. So while my first instinct is usually to be a bit more experimental in the approach, because of that innocent kind of quality that we were looking for, this just screamed traditional orchestra. And not just that, but a kind of capital R romantic 19th century sense of the orchestra and aesthetics, harmony, etc. This presented a very compelling challenge because a lot of the qualities that really define that 19th century approach to writing really run afoul of a modular, highly adaptive, interactive music system. So after quite literally 2 or 3 years of experimenting with different approaches, I repeatedly threw it all away and ended up with what I'd like to show you now. So to give a little bit of background on how we got here, for the first couple of years of development, the design of the missions were a bit more procedural, which meant that we couldn't fully predict what was going to be in a mission until you launched it and dove in. This definitely encouraged a very modular kind of approach because it meant that the music could recombine in the same way that the level itself was. Over time, though, the design migrated in a more bespoke, authored content kind of direction, and so it made sense for the music to do the same. At one point during one of our meetings, I reminded Arne that it's not uncommon for a lot of games to simply just play a linear track and let the highs and lows of the music kind of naturally and even coincidentally fall against the gameplay however they're going to. It's sort of like letting the cards just sort of fall where they may. And he said, I love it. I'm going to call that the serendipity system, and that name ended up sticking. And so where we've landed is relying on a certain amount of luck of the draw, but giving us a lot of real-time attenuation to the intensity of the mission. So I've chosen a kind of representative snippet of our combat music to help make this all really obvious. So first things first, we wanted the ability to scale up or down in real time based on danger that you encounter in a mission. We sliced it up 3 ways: low, medium, and high, where low means there's no enemies or maybe one, usually implicitly that you finished an encounter and you're picking off the last guy. Medium would be, a small handful or maybe one, medium strength enemy. And of course, high would be a big swarm or maybe a lieutenant or a mini boss, someone who's considerably more difficult. Now, here's the thing. This aesthetic, this 19th century romantic sense of the orchestra, doesn't really do well if your approach to addressing scaling difficulty is to just simply add stems. So I looked back and remembered that on the original Banner Saga trilogy, which I had previously done with Stoic, we, for technical reasons unrelated to the aesthetic of the music, had ended up in a situation where, rather than layering stems, I had recorded alternate performances of the orchestra. So I thought something like that could actually work really well here. So for low, medium, and high, you don't get, stems successively added on top and then on top again, but actually 3 discretely different orchestrations of the same piece that swap in real time for one another. So here is a taste of how those 3 sound. We record them separately and load them as parallel channels into Ys so that in real time, as your danger fluctuates up or down, we can just pivot into a low, medium, or high intensity version of the same piece of music. It doesn't sound like we're adding in stems or subtracting stems because we're actually shifting to a more forceful performance with instruments added or instruments removed, that sort of thing. So here is a representative little snippet of what that sounds like. So you can hear it's not just that it's more thick orchestration, but we're actually performing the music at higher and lower dynamics. And I would do things like alter the orchestration by, of course, adding a bunch of activity when we're at our highest energy, but also adding a bunch of sustaining, even droning strings and things like that when we're at our lowest energy. So obviously this music is missing something quite crucial: a tune. Melody is so important to the aesthetic of that romantic era sense of the orchestra. And we also talked a lot about, Spielberg films and Miyazaki, Studio Ghibli films, all of which put melody at the center and powerfully achieve that kind of innocence and optimistic quality we were going for. So melody had to be really important. Well, melody really makes a mess of this kind of thing because nothing makes a crossfade more obvious than the idea of a melody. So first off, here's what the melody of that little passage sounds like. In addition to recording these big, long 3 and 4 minute cues as 3 separate levels of dynamic intensity and orchestrational intensity, I also recorded all the melodies on their own individual pass after the fact, so that we could listen to the performance in our headphones and then add the melody on top on a separate channel. But if you're astute to how this kind of thing works, if we want the melody to be able to come and go in any way, then we're going to have to fade it in or out. Well, that really ruins the musicality that is so crucial to the aesthetic and to the spirit of this music. So here's how we approach that. First off, the music had to be recorded phrase at a time so that I could split the melody across 2 parallel channels in a kind of checkerboard fashion. What this lets us do is we can mute immediately whichever channel is already silent, so we just take it off the board before it becomes an issue. And then we only have to theoretically wait a few beats in order to mute the melody. So the rule became, when we are downshifting in energy and going from high to medium or medium to low, we get rid of the melody. And of course, the natural consequence of this is that it will happen theoretically, some second or 2 after the event in game, which triggered it, but it'll be maximally musical because we're never actually muting the tune. Likewise, we can add a melody back in when we're going from low to medium or medium to high, and do so only in anticipation of the start of the next phrase. So here we have our so-called serendipity system, but it's actually not really so serendipitous, because even though these are big long loops that are theoretically just plowing their way through 15 to 20 minutes worth of gameplay at a time, this ability to kind of adjust up and down in intensity in real time based on the continuous evolution of the gameplay, and to do so in a maximally musical way, meant that not only are we able to achieve this aesthetic of a very traditional, kind of even old-fashioned sensibility, but do so at no expense of the musicality that kind of aesthetic demands. As you might guess, this was very tedious to record because it meant basically every 3 or 4 minute piece had to be recorded 3 different ways and then a separate pass for the melodic statements. And there's actually one more aspect to it here that I'm not even showing, which is that when you're in the low energy state for an extended period of time, like maybe talking to an NPC or something like that, I have a whole bunch of additional solo instruments like a guitar or a mandolin or a solo violin that comes in to just add a bit of melodic spice during those kind of low moments, but those were not part of the orchestra session, which is what I'm focusing on here. Of course, the soundtrack album doesn't give any indication of this system, so if you haven't played the game, you wouldn't really be aware that this level of complexity is going on. In any case, that's a little bit about how the real-time interactivity in the mission system works for Towerborne. I hope you liked it, and we'll see you on the next one.